Welcome to Global Insights on the Lead, a podcast from New Lines magazine. I'm Kwangu Liwewe. For almost 2 decades following the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, Russia's involvement in Africa was at a bare minimum. After this long absence, the Kremlin gradually began to re-establish its foothold in Africa by engaging with friendly nations such as South Africa and the continental body, the African Union, in the mid-2000s. Fast forward to today, and Russia has significantly expanded its presence and influence across Africa. It has accelerated its military cooperation by establishing bases across the continent, even with countries that have experienced coups. Its private military companies, or PMCs, have a significant presence in several African countries like the Central African Republic, Mali, Libya, and Sudan, where it's engaging in mineral contracts, protecting oil and gas resources, and fighting jihadists in the Sahel region. In this episode of Global Insights, we take a deep dive into the implications of the growing Russian military footprint across the African continent, and we explore how Western nations are being pushed out of numerous countries as Russian soldiers occupy their former bases and military outposts. To help me unpack Russia's growing presence in Africa is Amie Ferris Rotman, our global news editor. Amie has reported extensively from across Russia and the former Soviet Union, where she was the Moscow correspondent for the Washington Post and Reuters. Welcome to the podcast, Amie. It's great to have you here.
It's great to be here. Hi, Kwangu.
So let's start with a historical background and just talk a little bit about the Soviet Union and its relationship with Africa. What was that like?
So the Soviet Union had a really good relationship with many African countries. And we could talk about whether or not it was good for Africans or only for Soviets. But I think you can say overall it was a positive relationship in the sense that relations were formed from the 1920s onwards when the Soviet Union itself was formed. And they were very friendly in the sense that African students were given scholarships to study in the Soviet Union. Many came to the Soviet Union to study medicine or science, and they were also given lots of benefits that were not available to ordinary Soviets, such as foreign currency and being able to visit certain special shops. The thing, obviously, I haven't talked about yet is while these were very rosy relationships, Moscow was using Africa for its own gains, and I think that is really important to understand. I mean, this was not, all these posters existed throughout the time of the Soviet Union, but especially around the time of in the 1960s when a lot of African countries gained independence from Western colonial powers, and there's these propaganda posters which say "friendship of the peoples." That you see an African person standing next to a Soviet person, and they're really happy to be friends. And I don't think that's painting the full picture, which is that Moscow was using African states to cement its own reputation as being anti-imperialist and anti-racist.
Yeah, but the flip side of that is, and I recall post-independence in some of these African countries that sent students to Moscow for, especially the doctors. And I think it was in the 80s and the early 90s, where when these students returned back to their home countries, they were not fully respected the way the indigenous students who had been educated in the home countries, such as in Lusaka, Zambia, the medical schools there. And then we had this influx of people coming in from Moscow, but much more respect was given to the local students. And Amie, I've just recently returned from South Africa, where South Africa has some students trained in Russia now, and they're actually struggling to find jobs in the South African market as doctors, which is a bit surprising because there is a shortage of doctors there.
But that's so interesting. I always see that's the thing. I always believed the opposite because maybe I'd been fed the Russian propaganda.
Well, I got out of South Africa, and it was a waiter who was waiting on me at a restaurant who happened to be a trained doctor in Russia. And he said that the South African Health Professionals Council, which is meant to give them accreditation or permission to work in the country, is just stalling on this. I don't know if they're seeing this education as inferior to South Africa training. I'm really not sure about that.
That's so interesting.
So, but moving on, still talking about this historical relationship and the support that the Soviet Union gave Africa. during its independence struggle. Do you think it's continuing to shape contemporary African attitudes towards Russia today?
Yes, I mean, there's no doubt that these historical relationships still carry weight. And obviously, you can speak better than me about African attitudes towards Russia. But what I can say is that I know Moscow is very clever when it comes to sustaining relationships. And I saw this a lot when I lived and reported there. And I saw this also when I lived in Kabul in Afghanistan. And I regularly interviewed officials at the huge sprawling Russian embassy there, which is unlike Western countries, unlike the Brits, unlike the Americans. The Russians are really good at maintaining these relationships over decades, speaking the languages of the countries where they conduct foreign policy. They've got officers in the embassy who spent years or decades covering the region, and it's a very different setup. So yes, I would say absolutely this friendship and these relations have stayed intact, even though the Soviet Union is no more. And we can look at specific examples as well. I mean, if you look at the Soviet Union's heyday, right, when it was facing off its number one rival of the United States, say 1966, the 1960s, the Soviet economy was really powerful. The space race was at its height, the arms race. And it was a very important decade for the Soviets, but it was also very important for many African countries who were gaining independence from countries like France, the United Kingdom. Many of these, Niger, Madagascar, Congo, Mali, were backed by Moscow in the 1960s and enjoy very good relations with Moscow today. So I think there's a very obvious connection we can make there.
Yeah, so clearly Putin is actively trying to revive all these historical ties. But also what's interesting to me is that when we look at Africa, 54 nations, right, their attitudes cannot be termed as monolithic. I mean, while the Soviet Union's historical support, it's still valued by some countries like South Africa, but other African countries are actually really wary when we look at Russia's intentions today. If you look at the voting patterns, for instance, when the war broke out with Ukraine, some African countries just decided to abstain because, they just wouldn't take sides on that. So it's interesting to know that Putin is actively trying to revive these historical ties.
He is trying to revive them, and it is very clever. I mean, I earlier said that Moscow can be quite clever at these relationships, and now I'm going to slightly contradict myself, but I would also say and stress that Russia loves an opportunity. And one of the biggest misconceptions about Putin is that he's this sort of master chess player, this strategist. And he really isn't. He is an opportunist, and he's very good at that. So where the West is failing or creating a power vacuum, Russia will usually try and step in. And this is something that we've seen for centuries. I mean, this predates the Soviet era, predates communism. It goes back to the 19th century. We've got Russia facing off the West. And where the West is leaving or losing interest or simply has waning interest or influence in African countries, you will see Russia stepping in. And we can really see this in the Sahel and in Central Africa in recent years. And I mean, there's another reason for this, which is much more financial and perhaps cynical, which is Africa is home to 30% of the world's critical minerals. And for Russia, they really, like the Chinese, they really want in on that. So the countries that Russia is propping up or helping or interfering in their affairs at the moment have a lot of rare earth minerals, and that is what Russia's doing. And I mean, it's a country that's increasingly isolated from the West because of the war in Ukraine, and it's got economic sanctions placed on it. And African countries offer unfettered access to riches, which is what Russia wants. And they also offer opportunities where there are not many internationally accepted rules. And I think this is something that we're going to see time and time again as Russia grows increasingly isolated, which it will.
Mm. And then, but Amie, the West is practically doing the same when we look at Africa's resources, and they've been doing this for decades. They've been exploiting African resources for their own enrichment. So basically, both Russia and the West they're driven by the need for Africa's resources. Although, as you've said, when it comes to Russia, they use different tactics, which you've just outlined. What is your comment on the West also being hypocritical about frowning at Russia making inroads in Africa?
Yeah, you've nailed it there. I mean, the West obviously is extremely hypocritical in criticizing Russia on the one hand and doing exactly the same on the other hand. And this has happened throughout history. And Russia likes to remind us of this. I mean, this is one of the talking points of the Russian foreign minister and was of the Soviet foreign minister before him, before Sergei Lavrov, which is, well, look at the West. You have done no different when it comes to African countries, when it comes to your invasion of Iraq, which the foreign minister likes to point out. And yes, exactly. I agree with you that they're very similar. What is different are the tactics. Russia has different rules than the United States. Russia is coated in this veneer of being anti-colonialist, which is, of course, very far from the truth. Russia offers security services, disinformation services. It's kind of a one-stop shop, if you will, for ruthless or would-be ruthless leaders. So if you want to consolidate your power, you can turn to Russia, and in exchange for lucrative mining contracts, they will allow you to basically pillage the country.
Amie, you've just mentioned something about Russia flaunting itself as anti-colonialist, and you said that's not right. Just give us a bit of background on that.
Going back to Russia and its role in the Soviet Union, I mean, the Soviet Union was a superpower at its height. It was extremely powerful. And one of the misconceptions about this is that it was just Russia. Well, it was Russia, but it was Russia conquering a lot of other nations and a lot of other countries and doing exactly what Western countries have done, which is be colonialist, which is to colonize other places. And the Russian Empire before the Soviet Union was extremely expansive and large and was in the Great Game with the British military and trying to conquer Afghanistan. So this goes way back. And of course, we're famously now seeing Russia's colonization of its neighbors. We're seeing it play out in Ukraine. And in February, we entered the third year of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But what we're seeing is how Russia colonized, or Moscow colonized, Ukraine in the past, going back hundreds of years. But we're also seeing how it's continuing to try colonize Russia in terms of the areas which are occupied territories. Whenever it takes a piece of land, one of the first things it does is try to get rid of the Ukrainian language. The second thing it does is burn all of its history books in the local schools and libraries. So that's kind of standard colonization, if you will. So it's a complete lie to say that Russia is not colonialist.
And then you also talk about disinformation services. How are they doing that?
Russia's an expert when it comes at disinformation services, and one of the best ways they do this, I say best in quotes, in terms of being most effective, is through the media. They are really successful at setting up TV channels, websites, newspapers, radio stations, which are mouthpieces for the government. And they've done this across Central and Western Africa as well. They've supported local radio stations. Russia Today is now called RT, which is the Kremlin propaganda TV channel, which has a lot of influence, has set up branches also across Africa. So has Sputnik, which is another Russian propaganda outlet. And yeah, that's how they do disinformation. That's how they do it really well.
It's interesting that you've mentioned RT. I do know a couple of friends of mine who watch it religiously. Anyway, moving on. So, Amie, unlike the US and its allies, the Kremlin doesn't make its arms deliveries contingent upon adherence to democratic principles or the protection of human rights, such as freedom of speech and everything else. Now, how will this impact democratic governance in affected countries? We've seen Russians go into countries that have been hit by coups now and welcomed there because of, they really want to get on board with delivering arms to these countries. How will this affect good governance in these countries?
If I had to use one word, I would say terribly. I mean, it's a recipe for disaster. What Russia does is, by providing this military support, they're helping to prop up contested regimes. And I'm not saying the West is perfect at all, as we've discussed, but unlike the West, basic principles of democracy and the rule of law are not adhered to. They're not even an issue for Russia. And what this means, what we see, is that civilians are often massively, disproportionately harmed. The private military companies, which we're going to discuss, I believe, and the soldiers, the Russian officials who are propping up these regimes are terrorizing the civilians often, and that results in displacement. And also what we've seen is widespread sexual assault of women and sometimes children, and that's happening across the countries where we're seeing these Russia-backed coups. Basically, what Russia's doing is, by having these private military companies, by having these paramilitaries that they've set there, they're allowing people with guns to be in control. And whenever we see people with guns in control, that spells bad news for civilians and bad news for women and children. I mean, that's what we've seen across the world forever. So Russia's basically allowing people to do, if you've got guns and money, you can do what you want.
Picking up on the Russian private military companies you've just talked about, I mean, they've been operating in Africa since the mid-2000s, and they really became super active in the mid-2010s. This is after Russia's annexation of the Crimea in 2014, and then there was the Syrian war in 2015. Now, Russia's private military companies have a presence currently in the Central African Republic, in Sudan, South Sudan, Congo, Gabon, Libya, and Mali. The most infamous one is the Wagner Group, which has now been disbanded. What's the latest with the PMCs operating in Africa? What are you hearing?
I think it's really important to stress that they're not going anywhere. I mean, you mentioned Wagner. When Wagner's boss, Yevgeny Prigozhin, was killed in August last year in a plane crash, which almost everyone, from pro-Kremlin people to critics of the Kremlin, say was orchestrated by the Kremlin for his opposition to Putin, one of the very first things that happened after his death was that the Russian Foreign Ministry dispatched its envoys to various African countries where Wagner was operating and said, don't worry, Russia is still here for you. And that is so important. I mean, essentially what they were saying is, yes, Prigozhin's dead. Yes, we killed Prigozhin, but don't worry, we will still be doing what we've been doing for all of this time. And this has just continued since August. We've seen various visits to African countries by Russian officials, and we've also seen the appearance or the reemergence of other PMCs. We've also seen new PMCs develop, and we've also seen PMCs develop which have direct links to the Russian military, which was not the case with Wagner. I mean, with Wagner, it was all a bit foggy and grey, and we didn't really, I mean, it took investigative journalists to make those links between Wagner and the Kremlin. But now we've got Redout, which is another PMC, which has essentially replaced Wagner and is all over Africa, as well as Ukraine, has tens of thousands of troops. And it's a branch of GRU, which is Russia's military intelligence. So, if anything, the end of Wagner, or rather the end of Prigozhin and Wagner, its people have since been reorganized. If anything, things are getting worse for African countries, I would say, for African countries that want to have the rule of law.
So let me get this right. On the one side, we have the private military companies operating in Africa, and then we have the official Russian forces, like those who are now arriving in Niger, who are taking over from the US troops who have been kicked out of Niger. They have to leave by September. So where does one draw the line with these two? Are the PMCs and the Russian forces, aren't they both just sanctioned by Kremlin?
Well, essentially, they play by different rules, allegedly, right? This is Russia we're talking about. So in theory, Russian troops representing the Russian military, the Russian Defense Ministry, can be held accountable to global rules of warfare and the international criminal courts. And of course, PMCs do not. And we've seen this play out in Ukraine. We have seen the International Criminal Court place arrests for Putin and as well for other high-ranking officials also his children's ombudsman in Ukraine, because of what they've been doing. But we haven't seen anything like this for PMCs. PMCs can operate essentially without abiding by any rules whatsoever. And they can also do things which people do not know about. I mean, if the Russian military is going to be involved in something, going to put troops somewhere, they need to, or they do, announce it. They put it on their website. They have a press conference. It's all out in the open. If PMCs are doing, are being placed somewhere, they're not accountable to anyone publicly, so they can do whatever they want, essentially. And it's just absolutely horrific.
But behind closed doors, Amie, they are answerable to Kremlin. Do you think so?
Yes, they're definitely answerable to the Kremlin. They're not answerable to anyone in the world, except for perhaps also the leaders that they're propping up. But even then, they're ultimately answerable to the Kremlin. And that's why Prigozhin was killed, because he dissented. He opposed Putin, who was his boss.
So now moving on, we've seen Russia host 2 Russia-Africa summits. One was in 2019 and the second one was in July 2023. Looks like the scramble for Africa is really moving fast. The US also had a similar summit, and so did China. Now, despite the Russia-Ukraine war and pressure from Western countries, we saw 17 heads of state, African heads of state, attend the second summit, where they signed several agreements with Russia. These are on prevention of arms race in space, on cooperation in information security, and combating terrorism. Would you say Russia is now actively presenting itself as an alternative to Western powers? And I ask this especially when it comes to combating terrorism. We're seeing them now going into Niger, taking over what the US was doing there, fighting against the jihadists.
This is a really interesting point, because in the past and in the early days of Putin's power 20 years ago, Russia were very much aligned with the West when it came to combating terrorism. I mean, Putin, apparently he was the first foreign leader to call up George Bush after the 9/11 attacks. And this was often touted by both countries until relations deteriorated between Washington and Moscow in recent years to do with the Ukraine war. So they certainly presented themselves as being aligned with the West and being almost, aligned and thinking the same way. And you're right, I would say that they are actively now distancing themselves from being seen as aligned with the West or similar to the West. They are now presenting themselves as, yes, an alternative to Western powers in terms of combating terrorism. I mean, whatever the critics say about Russia, and their motives for invading other countries and for being involved militarily in other countries, they have suffered their fair share of terrorism. They do know what that feels like. They've had a whole string of attacks in Moscow and across the North Caucasus throughout the 1990s and the 2000s, mostly to do with Chechnya. And most recently, we saw the Islamic State in Moscow launch its biggest, or Russia's biggest, terrorist attack in decades. So I would say that Russia is very in tune with this, and they know what they're doing. And absolutely, they want to be seen as the ones who know more than the West. I mean, that's always been the case.
Earlier, you talked about Russia and its disinformation campaign in various countries. In what other ways is Russia exerting its soft power in Africa?
I saw this video the other day, which was really freaky, and it was doing the rounds on social media. And I feel like it perfectly encapsulated some of Russia's soft power, which it showed school children in Mali dressed as Russian scouts. It was like the Boy and Girl Scouts that you can join in Russia today, except for they were wearing Soviet-style military caps from like the World War II era and waving a Soviet flag and singing a Soviet-era World War II victory song. And it was very bizarre. And while it seems kind of, ha, that's funny, I mean, it's not funny at all. I mean, what it is it means that there are Russian language schools being set up and cultural centers. And I would say this is happening in Mali more than other places. And I mean, I saw it in action in Afghanistan as well, which is Russia, unlike the US, right, which is very loud in its soft power, which tells everyone about it and makes a huge song and dance of what USAID is doing, or a kind of, helping countries achieve democracy, quote unquote. Russia does it quietly, so that they're setting up places where you can go and have free education. But of course, the education is geared towards promoting Russian policies. And that's exactly what these school children in Mali were doing. I mean, they're innocent school children, but that's exactly what they were participating in.
It would be interesting to see what their curriculum looks like in those schools.
I would love that. I mean, this is a story which I just, you and I would, yes, if only it wasn't so dangerous to go there. This is fascinating.
Now, you talked briefly about the way the US approaches its soft power, but what about China and other major powers? How are they exerting their soft power on the continent?
There was a Gallup poll just last month, actually in April, that said that the United States had been pushed out by Russia and China on the African continent in terms of soft power. And I found that fascinating also because whenever China and Russia are mentioned together in the same sentence, I just know there'll be screams of joy in the Kremlin because China is so powerful and sees Russia as a junior partner, and Russia wants to be with China. But more in answer to your question, I mean, what China's doing is they're focused on money a lot more, I would say. They don't put their militaries in African countries, whereas Russia, they've got their militaries there quite openly and unopenly, as we've talked about. China courts the African elites, and it does this by luring them into the Beijing's Belt and Road project, which means infrastructure jobs and huge long-term projects. I don't think what Russia's doing is very long-term in its outlook. China plays a very slow, long game, right? That's what China does. Whereas Russia, they see opportunity. They're using decades-old relationships, and they're putting troops there, propping up regimes, getting minerals. It's much faster and quicker. And if I can use the word superior, I would say China's soft power on the continent is far superior. It will last a lot longer.
Interesting. Amie, thank you so much for your insights as we discussed Russia and the other countries and basically just the scramble for Africa, which I predict will continue.
Oh, yes. Thank you, Kwangu.
This week's episode was produced by Finbar Anderson and hosted by me, Kwangu Liwewe. For a deeper understanding of global news and current affairs, subscribe to The Lead on your favorite podcast app, where you'll find global insights the last Friday of every month. If you enjoyed this week's episode, please rate us and leave a review. It will really help us grow our audience. See you soon.